Korean Mafia boss's 6-year-old called 911 on his own father. Black dispatcher stayed on the line for 4 hours. A 6-year-old boy, a burner phone, and a secret so dangerous that the wrong word from anyone in that room could have gotten 3 people killed before sunrise. This is not a story about a crime. This is a story about what happens when the most innocent thing in the world, a child who is scared and just wants someone to help, walks straight into the middle of something so complicated, so deadly, so layered with secrets, that even the adults with badges and guns didn't know what they were walking into. And the only person who held it all together for 4 straight hours was a woman named Monique Tran, a 911 dispatcher. She never left her desk. She never fired a weapon. She never entered that house. But she is the reason 3 people walked out of it alive. This is that story. It was 2:17 in the morning when the call came in. Monique Tran had been working the overnight shift at the Seoul Metropolitan Emergency Dispatch Center for 11 years. She had heard things on that line that most people wouldn't believe. Screaming, silence, confessions, the last words of people who didn't make it. She had talked jumpers back from ledges and coached fathers through delivering their own babies on the side of the highway. She had a system. She had protocols. She had a voice that her supervisor once described as the human equivalent of a hand on the shoulder. Calm, warm, immovable. But when the call came in at 2:17 that Tuesday morning in late November, even Monique felt something shift inside her chest. Because the voice on the other end of the line was not panicked. It was not hysterical. It was small and quiet and terrified in a way that was worse than screaming. It was a child. "Hello?" the boy whispered. Monique straightened in her chair. Her hand moved automatically to her headset, pressing it tighter against her ear. "Hello, sweetheart. You've reached emergency services. My name is Monique. Can you tell me your name?" A pause. She could hear breathing. Small, unsteady breaths. "Ye-joon?" the boy said. And then, after another pause, "I'm not supposed to be on this phone." Monique's eyes were already moving across her screen, triangulating the signal. The call was coming from a residential address in Sungbuku, one of the wealthier districts in the city, a large estate. The kind of address that didn't show up often in emergency dispatch logs. She flagged it immediately and kept her voice perfectly level. "That's okay, Ye-joon. I'm really glad you called. Can you tell me how old you are?" 6, he said. 6 years old. You're very brave calling like this. Can you tell me why you called tonight? Did something happen?" Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him thinking, weighing something. And then he said the words that changed everything. "There's a man crying in the basement." Monique's hand moved to her mouse, pulling up the address file, flagging for dispatch, tagging the call as priority. Her voice didn't change by a single degree. "Okay, Ye-joon. Thank you for telling me that. Can you stay on the phone with me while I help you figure out what to do?" "Yes," the boy whispered. "But you have to be quiet. My appa doesn't know I'm up." Bae In-soo was not a man who appeared in newspaper crime sections. He was not the kind of Korean crime figure who made headlines, who flashed jewelry in nightclub VIP rooms, who had his face plastered across wanted bulletins. He was 44 years old, fit in the quiet way of a man who trained every morning without being showy about it. And he ran the eastern operations of one of the oldest criminal organizations in Seoul with the kind of invisible authority that most men in his position spent decades trying to manufacture. He had a house in Songbukgu. He had a wife who traveled for work and was currently in Busan for the week. He had a son named Ye-joon, who was 6 years old, loved dinosaurs and gimbap, and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. And tonight, in the basement of that beautiful house, he had a problem. The man in the basement was not supposed to be alive. His name, the name he had given when Bae In-soo's people had picked him up 4 days ago, was Park Sung-min. He had shown up in the organization's orbit 6 weeks earlier, ingratiating himself into the mid-level distribution network in Mapogu, moving cautiously but skillfully through the layers, asking the right questions, never asking too many. He was good. Whoever had trained him well. But 3 of Bae In-soo's lieutenants had a combined 90 years of experience between them, and on the 4th day, one of them noticed something, a pattern in the questions, a consistency in the timing of when Park Sung-min happened to show up and when certain information later became inconvenient. It was nothing that would hold up in court, but in the world Bae In-soo operated in, you didn't wait for things to hold up in court. They brought Park Sung-min in on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Bae In-soo knew 2 things for certain. The first was that Park Sung-min was not Park Sung-min. His real name was Detective Sergeant Choi Jun-ho, and he was 18 months into an undercover operation being run out of the Organized Crime Investigation Division. The second thing Bae In-soo knew was that this changed absolutely everything, and not in the direction his lieutenants were expecting. In his world, the discovery of an undercover cop was supposed to have one outcome: clean, final, untraceable. That was the protocol his organization had followed for 30 years. It was brutal, but it was the reason the organization had survived for 30 years, while others had not. But Bae In-soo had been thinking for the past 4 days, and the more he thought, the more he understood that killing Detective Sergeant Choi Jun-ho was the worst possible move he could make. If the detective disappeared, an undercover operation of that scale, 18 months, OCID resources, a handler, a full support team, would not simply stop. It would accelerate. His disappearance would become the evidence that the organization had been too careful to leave in 18 months of surveillance. Bae In-soo would be dismantled. Not arrested. Dismantled. The organization would collapse, and the collapse would be ugly, and people he had protected for decades would not survive it. So Bae In-soo had been doing something his lieutenants would have found incomprehensible if they had known about it. He had been keeping Choi Jun-ho alive. Not comfortable. The basement was cold, and the detective had a bruised jaw from the initial confrontation, but alive, and secretly fed, and carefully thinking through how to get this man out of his house and back to his department without anyone in Bae In-soo's organization knowing it had happened. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever attempted. He was still working it out on the night his 6-year-old son found a burner phone in his study, heard the sound of a man crying through the basement door, and called 911. "Ye-joon," Monique said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully, okay? Can you do that?" "Yes," the boy whispered. "You said there's a man crying in the basement, Is the basement door close to where you are right now? I'm in the hallway, Ye-joon said. Outside my room. The door to the basement is down the stairs. Okay. I don't want you to go near that door, all right? Stay exactly where you are. Can you tell me, is your appa home? A pause. Yes. His light was on before. Before? Before I came out. His study light was on. It's not on now. I think he went to sleep. Monique flagged this. Father on premises, possibly asleep. Child in hallway. Unidentified individual in basement. She had already dispatched a welfare check. 2 units, no lights, and no sirens, per the protocol for sensitive residential calls in that district. But something was pulling at her. The address. The district. The kind of house where a burner phone sits in a study. Ye-joon, you said you found the phone in your appa's study. Is that where you are now? No, I put it in my pajama pocket and came out to the hallway. Smart kid. Okay, good. You're doing really well, Ye-joon. Really, really well. She kept her voice the same, warm, steady. Can you tell me, the man in the basement, how do you know he's crying? Can you hear him from upstairs? Sometimes. Earlier tonight I heard him. It woke me up. A pause, and then the boy said something that hit Monique somewhere deep. He sounded scared, like when I get scared, but a grown-up sound. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. You did the right thing calling, Ye-joon. The very right thing. I'm going to make sure that man is okay, but I need you to stay on the phone with me. Can you do that? Don't hang up, no matter what. Even if you hear something, even if your appa comes out, you keep this phone in your hand and you keep talking to me. What do I say to my appa if he sees me? Tell him you had a bad dream and you couldn't sleep. That's the truth, isn't it? You are scared right now. A tiny, solemn pause. Yes. Then that's what you tell him, okay? Okay, Ye-joon said. The 2 patrol units arrived on the street outside the Bay Estate at 2:41 in the morning. Officer Park Ji-won and her partner, Officer Han Sung-jin, parked half a block away, killed the engine, and sat for a moment looking at the house. It was large and dark and still, set back from the street behind a stone wall with a gate. The lights were off except for a single lamp visible through a window on the upper floor. They had been briefed by dispatch. Welfare check. 6-year-old caller. Possible individual in distress in the basement. No weapon reported. No violence reported. Father on premises. What dispatch had not told them, because dispatch didn't know yet, was whose house this was. It took Officer Han approximately 90 seconds after running the address to turn very carefully to his partner and say, in a voice that was almost completely flat, Ji-won, this is Bae and Sue's house. Ji-won didn't say anything for a moment. She was looking at the gate. We go in, she said. We go in, he agreed. They radioed for backup before they got out of the car. Inside, Bae and Sue had not been asleep. He had been sitting in the dark of his study, in the chair that faced the door, and he had been thinking. He was very good at thinking in the dark. He had been doing it for 20 years. He heard the gate alert at 2:43, not an alarm, just a small chime on his phone, the kind of notification that most people would have turned off. He looked at the screen. 2 figures at the gate. He pulled up the exterior camera feed and looked at them for a very long time. Police uniforms. His first instinct, the one built by 20 years of survival, was to go to the basement. Not to run, he was too smart to run, but to assess. To look at what was in the basement and think about whether what was in the basement was a problem. His second instinct, the one that came a half-second later and was sharper and colder, was to think about why police were at his gate at 2:43 in the morning, unannounced, with no sirens, in a way that suggested they already knew to be quiet. His third thought was, Ye-joon. He was out of the chair before he finished the thought, moving fast and quiet through the dark house, up the stairs and down the hallway toward his son's room. The door was slightly open, which it shouldn't have been at this hour. He pushed it gently. The bed was empty. He heard breathing from the hallway. He turned slowly. Ye-joon was sitting on the floor against the wall, knees pulled up, his dinosaur pajamas slightly too big for him, holding something small and dark in his hand. He looked up at his father, and his eyes were enormous, and his lower lip was trembling. Bae-in-soo looked at what was in his son's hand. He recognized the phone. He had been looking for it for 2 days, ever since he realized it wasn't where he'd left it. He crouched down in front of his son. His voice came out quieter and softer than he had expected. Ye-joon. The boy's chin was shaking. Are you on the phone with someone right now? Bae-in-soo asked. Ye-joon nodded, one small, terrified nod. Bae-in-soo looked at the phone. The call timer read 0 hours, 26 minutes, and 14 seconds. 26 minutes. The police were at his gate. His son had been on with emergency services for 26 minutes. And in the basement, a man who was a detective and who was alive because Bae-in-soo had decided that killing him was the stupidest thing he could do, was still alive and still terrified, and had apparently been crying loudly enough that a 6-year-old could hear him through the floors. Bae-in-soo sat down on the hallway floor next to his son. He put his back against the wall. He looked at the ceiling. And then he did the thing that no one in his organization, no lieutenant, no rival, no law enforcement officer who had ever studied him, would have predicted. He held out his hand to Ye-joon and said, "Give me the phone." Monique had been tracking every sound, every shift in background noise for 26 minutes. She had heard the boy's breathing change. She had heard the soft sound of footsteps. She had heard a door. And then she had heard the whispered exchange in Korean between a child and an adult male, and she had brought in one of the bilingual supervisors to translate in real time through her second earpiece. When the adult male voice came on the line, it was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who was used to terrifying situations and had decided, in this particular moment, not to be terrified. "Who am I speaking with?" he said, in English. "My name is Monique Tran," she said. "I'm an emergency dispatcher. Your son called us tonight because he was worried about someone in your home." A pause. Not a guilty pause, more like a man running calculations. "Is my son safe?" Bae-in-soo said. "Your son is completely safe. He's been very brave. He's right next to you, isn't he?" "Yes." "Good. I'd like him to stay with you. Is that all right?" "That is all right." "Sir, I have officers at your gate. Before I tell them to come in, I'd like to talk with you for a moment. Can you tell me your name?" A longer pause. "You already know my name." "I'd like to hear you say it." The pause this time was different. It had something in it, Not defiance, but something closer to calculation, followed by a decision. "Bae In-soo," he said. Monique kept her voice exactly the same. "Mr. Bae, your son told me there's a person in your basement. Can you tell me about that person?" The silence stretched out for 8 seconds. Monique counted them. She had learned over 11 years that how a person filled a silence told you almost everything. "The person in my basement," Bae In-soo said finally, "is not in danger from me." "But he is there." "He is there." "Is he injured?" "He has a bruise. He is not otherwise injured. He has been given water and food." Monique kept her face completely still. She nodded once, slowly, to herself. "Mr. Bae, I want to be straightforward with you because I think you're a straightforward person. I have officers at your gate and more on the way. This situation right now can go one of 2 ways, and I think you already know that. I think that's why you sat down on the floor next to your son and took this phone. Am I right?" The silence was only 3 seconds this time. "You're right," Bae In-soo said. "Then let's talk." What followed was one of the most unusual conversations in the 11-year career of Monique Tran, and she would later describe it to investigators in a deposition that took 4 hours and covered 62 pages of transcript. Bae In-soo did not confess. He was far too careful for that. But over the next 90 minutes, sitting on the hallway floor of his house with his 6-year-old son asleep against his shoulder, and 2 police officers waiting at his gate and a 911 dispatcher in his ear, he communicated in the clipped, layered, carefully deniable language of a man who had survived 20 years in organized crime, the essential facts of the situation. There was a man in the basement. The man was alive and unhurt except for a bruise to the jaw sustained during what Bae In-soo described with remarkable understatement as an involuntary relocation. The man was connected to law enforcement. Bae In-soo had known this for 4 days. And Bae In-soo had not acted on this knowledge in the way his organization would have expected, because doing so would have been catastrophic. He wanted the man returned to his organization in a way that did not expose what had happened. Monique listened to all of this. She asked questions that were simple and direct and did not editorialize. She did not say, "So you kidnapped a police officer?" She did not say, "You're confessing to a crime." She said things like, "Help me understand what you mean by that," and then what happened? And what would you need in order for this to resolve safely tonight? She also, simultaneously, was relaying information to her supervisor, who was on the phone with the Organized Crime Investigation Division, who were in the process of having what could diplomatically be described as an extremely high-stakes internal conversation about a detective who had been missing for 4 days, and whose handler had been telling anyone who asked that he was simply dark, off the grid by design, as per protocol, because the alternative explanation was one nobody wanted to say out loud. At 3:41 in the morning, Monique's supervisor told her, through her second earpiece, that OCID had confirmed the identity of the person in the basement, that they were prepared to send a plainclothes officer to the gate, that they did not want patrol units entering the house, that this had become, in the space of 84 minutes, something significantly above a welfare check. Monique relayed none of this to Bae In-soo. She didn't need to. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." "Go ahead," he said. Your son is asleep on your shoulder right now. A pause. Yes. What do you want him to know about tonight, 10 years from now? The silence that followed that question was the longest of the entire call. 31 seconds. Monique counted every one of them. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that the worst thing you could do in the crucial moments was talk. When Bae-in-soo spoke, his voice had changed. Not much, but enough. I want him to know I did the right thing, he said, when it was hard. Then let's figure out how to make that happen, Monique said. Choi Jun-ho had been in the basement for 4 days. He was 31 years old, had been with the Organized Crime Investigation Division for 6 years, and had been undercover in Bae-in-soo's network for 18 months. He was one of the best they had. His handler had recruited him out of the Violent Crimes Unit specifically because of his ability to stay calm under pressure and read people quickly and accurately. He was testing both of those skills to their absolute limit in the basement of the Bay estate. He knew, on the first day, that he'd been burned. The way they brought him in, not rough, not immediately violent, but precise and inevitable, like a door closing, told him that this was not an interrogation about something minor. They knew. He didn't know how much they knew, but they knew enough. On the second day, when Bae-in-soo himself came down and sat across from him and looked at him for a long time without speaking, Choi Jun-ho understood something that recalibrated every assumption he'd been working with. Bae-in-soo was not angry. He was not calculating how to dispose of him. He was thinking. The thinking of a man with a problem, not the thinking of a man with a decision already made. Choi Jun-ho did something then that went against every instinct 18 months of undercover work had sharpened in him. He stopped performing. He dropped the persona, the backstory, the manufactured history of Park Sung-min, and he looked back at Bae-in-soo as himself. As a detective named Choi Jun-ho, who was 31 years old and had a mother who called him every Sunday, and a girlfriend who thought he was on a long consulting job in Incheon. You haven't decided yet, Choi Jun-ho said. Bae-in-soo looked at him for another long moment. No, he said, and he went back upstairs. The next 2 days were cold and quiet and terrifying in a way that Choi Jun-ho would later struggle to articulate. Not because he was being hurt, because he wasn't. Because the silence meant a calculation was still being made, and he didn't know what the variables were, and the only thing he could do was wait and try to stay mentally intact. On the 4th night, the night of the phone call, Choi Jun-ho had cried. He hadn't meant to. He was exhausted and cold and had been running worst-case scenarios in his head for 4 days, and somewhere around 2 a.m, the control slipped, and he cried. He put his face in his hands and cried like he was 16 years old, quietly, in the way men cry when they're trying not to be heard. He didn't know there was a 6-year-old on the other side of the ceiling, listening. At 4 a.m, the basement door opened. Bae-in-soo came down the stairs alone. He stood in front of Choi Jun-ho, and he looked at him. And Choi Jun-ho looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. You're going to walk out of here tonight, Bae-in-soo said. There's someone at the top of the stairs who's going to take you out of the house. You're not going to say anything about this location, and you're not going to identify any of my people who brought you here. That's not a threat, it's a condition. Do you understand the difference? Choi Jun-ho understood the difference. In his world, understanding the difference between a threat and a condition was sometimes the thing that kept you breathing. Who decided this? Choi Jun-ho said. Bae and Soo looked at him steadily. My son called 911. A pause. Choi Jun-ho looked at the ceiling and then back at the man in front of him. How old? 6. Choi Jun-ho sat with that for a moment. I have a nephew who's 6, he said. His name is Jae-won. He's afraid of dogs and obsessed with space. Bae and Soo said nothing, but something shifted in the set of his jaw. Your son saved my life, Choi Jun-ho said. My son was scared of a man crying in the basement, Bae and Soo said. He did what a child does when something is wrong. He asked for help. He paused. He's smarter than me, in some ways. At 4:14 in the morning, the front gate of the Bae estate opened. Choi Jun-ho came out of the house on his own feet, moving carefully, wearing the same clothes he'd been taken in and carrying nothing. There were 4 people waiting for him in the driveway. A plainclothes OCID officer named Lieutenant Kwan, a medic, Officer Park Ji-won, who had been sitting in her patrol car for 2 hours at Monique's instruction, and who deserved a commendation for the patience she had demonstrated, and, because this is the detail that does not fit any protocol and cannot be explained except by the simple fact of who Monique Tran was, a second phone connected to the dispatch line so that Monique could hear it herself. She heard the sound of the gate. She heard footsteps on gravel. She heard Lieutenant Kwan say, in a voice that broke slightly in the middle, Sergeant, you're okay. You're out. She heard a medic say something she couldn't make out. She heard Choi Jun-ho say very quietly, I need to call my mother. Monique Tran, who had been on the line for 3 hours and 57 minutes, pressed her fingertips against her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. Then she pulled her hand away and said, into her headset, to the one person still on the line, Ye-joon? From somewhere inside the house, in the hallway upstairs, a small, sleepy voice said, I'm still here. The man in the basement is okay, Monique said. He's outside and he's safe. You did it. A pause. She could hear the boy processing this. Is he still crying? Ye-joon asked. Monique listened to the sound coming through the second phone. Choi Jun-ho's voice, low and ragged, talking to someone from his unit. And yes, the sound of a man who was crying again, but differently. The kind of crying that happens when something terrible is suddenly over. A little bit, Monique said, but different now. Good crying. Oh, Ye-joon said, and then, my appa is crying too. Monique closed her eyes again, this time for longer than 5 seconds. That's okay, she said. That's allowed. The official record of what happened that night is, necessarily, incomplete. The OCID investigation into Bae In-soo's network continued for another 8 months after the events of that Tuesday morning in November. It resulted in 11 arrests, none of which were Bae In-soo. The conditions under which Choi Jun-ho was released, the conversations that had taken place in the days prior, the precise nature of the arrangement, all of it lived in a gray zone that prosecutors looked at for a long time and then looked away from, for reasons that had as much to do with institutional embarrassment about a missing undercover officer as they did with the legal complexity of the situation. Choi Jun-ho gave a deposition. He described his captivity as non-violent and characterized his release as voluntary. He did not, in his deposition or in any subsequent proceeding, identify the individuals who had transported him to the estate. His handler resigned 3 months later. A review board found no negligence. No one believed that finding, but no one said so officially. Bae In-soo was never charged in connection with the events of that night. This is a fact that sits uncomfortably in the official record, and it was the subject of considerable internal discussion. And the discussion resulted in a conclusion that is best summarized as, the alternative was worse. He was, however, charged in the subsequent investigation on 3 counts related to financial fraud and 1 count related to the facilitation of illegal goods distribution. He served 14 months. His lawyer was exceptional. Monique Tran was cited for distinguished performance. She was given a commendation by the department, which she accepted at a small ceremony attended by her supervisor and 3 colleagues, because she had declined the larger event. She did not speak to the press. When a journalist contacted her for comment, she replied with 4 sentences. She was just doing her job. She was glad everyone was safe. She couldn't comment on open matters, and she thought Ye-joon was one of the bravest kids she had ever spoken to. Choi Jun-ho went back to work 8 weeks after that night, after mandatory leave and mandatory counseling, both of which he actually needed and was, according to his counselor, surprisingly open about needing. He requested a transfer out of deep undercover work. It was granted. He still calls his mother every Sunday. He told her, when she asked where he'd been, that he'd had a complicated assignment. She told him to eat more soup. He agreed. But here is the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into depositions and official records, and it is the part that matters most. 3 weeks after that Tuesday morning in November, a package arrived at the Seoul Metropolitan Emergency Dispatch Center. It was addressed, by hand, to Monique Tran. The handwriting on the outside was small and uneven, the way a 6-year-old's handwriting is. Letters that are technically the right letters, but each living slightly differently from the others, not yet domesticated into uniformity. Inside was a drawing. It was done in crayon. 3 figures. The first figure was small and wearing what appeared to be dinosaur pajamas. The second figure was taller and was holding the small figure's hand. The third figure was the tallest and was shown standing in a doorway, which had a small rectangle next to it that the artist had colored yellow, a phone. All 3 figures had faces drawn with great seriousness. Circles for heads, dots for eyes, curved lines for mouths. All 3 of the curved lines pointed upward. All 3 were smiling. Underneath the figures, in the same small, uneven handwriting, was a single line of text. It said, "The man stopped crying. Thank you. Ye-joon." Monique kept the drawing. She had it for years. When she eventually left dispatch after 19 years on the job, she took it with her. It was one of 4 things she took from her desk. The others were a photo of her kids, a coffee mug her mother had given her, and a small plant that had survived 11 repottings and which she'd named Gerald. She told an interviewer once, when she finally agreed to speak to someone about that night, that the drawing was the clearest thing she knew about the job, about what the job actually was, underneath all of the protocols and training and shift schedules and mandatory overtime. The job was this: Someone is scared, and they reach out, and you stay on the line. That was it. That was the whole thing. Someone is scared in the middle of the night, and they don't know what to do, and they do the one thing available to them. They call for help. And you answer, and you stay, and you don't hang up. No matter how complicated it gets, no matter how many other things are happening, no matter how dangerous the situation is, or how many levels of it you can't see, you stay on the line. You keep the connection. Because that connection, that thin, fragile, voice-to-voice thread between a scared person and someone who will not leave them, is sometimes the only thing standing between three people and catastrophe. A 6-year-old in dinosaur pajamas understood that instinctively, because children understand things instinctively that adults have to learn and relearn. He heard a man crying who sounded like he was scared, the way Ye-joon got scared, and he thought, someone should help him. So he found a phone, and he called. He didn't know it was a burner phone his father used for things he was never supposed to know about. He didn't know that the man in the basement was a police officer who had been missing for 4 days and whose disappearance had set off a chain of institutional anxiety that went up several floors in several buildings. He didn't know that the woman who answered was carrying 19 years of training and hard experience in her voice. He didn't know that his phone call was going to save not one life, but 3. The detective in the basement, the officers who would have walked into something they didn't understand if the situation had resolved differently, and, in a way that is harder to quantify but no less real, his father, who had been sitting in the dark for 4 days trying to find a way out, and who had been found, finally, by his own son's decision to do the right thing. Ye-joon didn't know any of that. He was 6. He knew a man was crying. He knew that was not okay. And he called. Bae-in-soo served his 14 months. When he got out, Ye-joon was 8 years old and had acquired new opinions about several dinosaurs and a passionate devotion to a particular animated show about robots. Bae-in-soo sat with him on the couch and watched 2 episodes of the robot show in a row and didn't say anything, just sat there with his son leaning against his arm and thought about the night on the hallway floor and the phone call and the woman's voice on the other end saying things like, "What do you want your son to know 10 years from now?" He thought about that question a lot in the 14 months. It was the question that had moved something in him. Not convinced him. He was not a man who was convinced by questions generally. But it had moved something, shifted the weight, clarified something he hadn't been able to clarify on his own in 4 days of sitting in the dark. He was not a good man. He knew that. He had made choices over 20 years that he would not pretend were anything other than what they were. But he was a father. And on that night, in that hallway, when his son had looked up at him with enormous eyes and a trembling lip and a burner phone in his hand, and the entire terrible machinery of his life had converged on that single moment, he had chosen, for the first time in a long time, the thing that would not require him to lie to his son forever. He couldn't undo the 20 years. He couldn't make himself a different person. But he could sit on the couch and watch robot cartoons and be present, and he could answer questions honestly when his son asked them, in the way that a man answers questions when he has decided that honesty is the only thing left that costs him nothing. One night, when Ye-joon was 9, the boy looked up from his homework and said, out of nowhere, "Appa, that night I called 911. Did I do the right thing?" Bae-in-soo set down what he was reading. "Yes," he said, without question. Ye-joon nodded, thinking about this. Then, the lady on the phone was nice. I remember her voice. She was very good at her job, Bae In-soo said. I want to do a job like that someday, Ye-joon said, where you help people. Bae In-soo looked at his son for a moment. He thought about everything that the word help had meant in his life, and what it had cost, and what it had looked like in its real and uncomplicated form. A small boy in a dark hallway, reaching for a phone because someone was scared. You already did, he said. Once. Ye-joon went back to his homework. Bae In-soo picked up what he'd been reading. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment near Mapogu, Detective Sergeant Choi Jun-ho was on the phone with his mother, who was asking whether he was eating enough and whether he'd met anyone nice, and he was saying yes and not yet, and she was tutting in the warm way she always tutted, and his tea was getting cold on the table beside him, and outside the window the city was doing what cities do at night, glowing and humming and churning through its 10,000 private catastrophes and moments of grace, most of which would never be recorded by anyone. And at the Seoul Metropolitan Emergency Dispatch Center, on the overnight shift, someone's phone was ringing, and someone answered.
Hello, welcome to the Quiet Blue Stories. I believe that you enjoyed the story that you just finished watching now. If you enjoy it, I want you to like and subscribe and share this video so that you can always be updated once we upload our next video. Thank you very much. Bye bye.